Stasis originates in Aristotle's rhetoric, or at least its first recorded message is in there. And so, as with many things rhetorical, we've got those beginnings in Aristotle. However, the name we associate most closely with Stasis is Hermagoras of Timnos. Hermagoras is a Hellenistic thinker, so he lives BCE. To get back to that date thing we talked about in class. And Hermagoras is the one whose name just gets linked with this because it was his theory. What is stasis? Stasis is a standing still or a point of conflict. I think that it's a lovely concept, this notion of the standing still. We think of stasis as being a place from which we can no longer move. But if we understand this Aristotelian notion of rhetoric, rhetoric needs to exist. Rhetoric needs to be used in a situation of exigency. That is, we should not argue simply to argue. Rhetoric should not be valued in itself, but rather as its productive way of forming knowledge. So it is when we can no longer move forward that we need rhetoric. However, we aren't necessarily that gifted in finding out exactly where our point of conflict is. And stasis is an attempt to help us come to a standstill and find that point of conflict so that rhetorical investigation can begin. It is a further continuation and amplification of the notion of invention that we find in Aristotle. Invention being the discovery of the means of persuasion. That making a road translation that Kennedy gives us. And how do we make a road? This is an art, rhetoric. So Aristotle is keen to say that art or techne has method. Heuristic is part of that method for that. Now, heuristic gets amplified in a variety of different ways. Heuristics exist for a number of things, and stasis became a very important one. And it revolves around asking certain questions. Again, with the notion that asking these questions, we can best understand how to proceed in arguments. So a legitimate search for information. Stasis includes 4 questions. Now, these are Hermagoras' questions. There are a number of different sets of questions that are propounded by different theorists for stasis. I believe that stasis tends to be very cultural. So the questions that we ask are going to vary by situation, by culture, by country, by the setting that we're in, by the institution that we're in. So the 4 questions that Hermagoras gives us are stochasmos, that is questions of fact, horos, questions of definition, poitotes, questions of quality, and metalepsis, questions of jurisdiction. Stochasmos is the basic starting point for any rhetorical situation, and that is, what are the facts of the situation? Now, the emphasis here tends to be on, again, because we're trying to find a stopping point, the emphasis here is on what do we know. And by know, given that we're in a world where we can't know the truth of many things in civic life, what can we agree are the facts of the situation? I think that stasis makes the most sense within a judicial world, and we have to know what it is that will be stipulated as something that happened. So, what happened? What are the facts of the situation? Horos, what are the definitions? What are we going to call the things that we talk about in this argument? Do we have terms that are themselves problematic? So a run-through of the definitions. What is first-degree murder? What do we mean when we say abortion? What do we mean when we say corporal punishment, etc.? What are the definitions of the terms? Poiotes, what is the quality of the action? The notion of poiotes is a way of limiting the argument, a way of putting boundaries around the argument, a way of saying we're going to talk about this and not about that. Again, it's a way of focusing in on points of conflict. So what is the quality of what's done? Was it a good thing or a bad thing? I think that crimes can be committed, but we can have sympathy, for instance, with the crimes. Metalepsis, again, you'll notice that this is a very particular sort of question about jurisdiction. Is this the place where we should be having this dispute? This is of particular relevance in various court situations, but I think it's also relevant in our own civic lives. Should this be a public conversation? Should this be a private conversation? Should this be something that people at this level talk about, or is this a question more for people of another level to talk about? So a lot to do with the situation at hand, and the institutions that are involved are going to have a lot to say about jurisdiction. Is this a question that it matters that this person weighs in on, and so on? Again, it's another limitation of the argument. We might want to think of stasis generally as being a boundary setter, a way of saying, this is what we're going to talk about, and we're not going to talk about these other things. This is going to be the focal point. Metalepsis is supposed to be the point at which we can get this big picture, that we can fully understand the point of dispute. So the method of stasis is as follows. We ask these questions in order to investigate all the issues so that the specific stasis of the situation can be understood, can be seen. Now, I think we perhaps underestimate at times the difficulty of really participating in an argument that is productive and that is worthwhile. And stasis ensures that the argument will go someplace because it agrees that we're standing in the same place with the same questions to answer. So I think that rhetoric, and this gets back to Aristotle's notion that rhetoric isn't so much persuasion for Aristotle, but it's the means through which we understand what needs to be done. It's an investigation tool. It's a way of inquiring about a situation. It's a productive form of knowledge. It's a way of producing a kind of knowledge, in this particular case, civic. Quintilian says about stasis, to sum it up, that stasis is a fixed point around which the controversy revolves. And I think that's a very helpful way of thinking about stasis. Okay, I just wanted to give you this one case to think about some aspects of stasis. I just pulled this off of the internet, and this happened apparently 5 months ago in the summer. So I'll read to you the first part of the story from NBC. The mother of the 14-year-old Idaho boy accused of shooting his father in the head and killing him has broken her silence. Cindy Nagel spoke out just hours after burying her ex-husband, Jason Nagel. Police say the 33-year-old was shot by his son, Zach, in their Caldwell, Idaho home last week. So Zach Nagel kills his father. Zach is 14 years old. So if we're going to go back through and look at the stasis questions, the first thing we want to ask ourselves is, what are the facts of the case? One of the facts of the case is that Zach killed his father. I believe it was with a gun. He shot him, shot him in the head. And that we know for sure. We've got a picture on the website of Zach in his yellow prison outfit with his hands in chains and so on. Now, obviously, the facts of the case that are of most interest are the exploration that we get past in this stopping point. Zach's mother says her son is a good boy, according to the NBC article, and is still distraught about the whole situation. Nagel added that she never suspected possible abuse occurring at Jason's home. I never suspected it. We hadn't lived together for a long time, so I can't be positive on it. It would not have been at the top of my mind, said Nagel. So we have this first sort of question that we need to ask about fact. Was Zach being abused? Zach's attorney, Charles Crafts, says he's building a potential sex abuse case to rebut the prosecution. Well, I can say this. The prosecution is looking at this like a case, and I'm looking at this like a potential sex abuse case or a potential physical abuse case. In addition, Canyon County Prosecutor John Bujak says Zachary is innocent until proven guilty. Bujak also answered why Zachary Nagel is charged with first-degree murder. The reason it's murder 1 is because murder contemplates a premeditated act, because the murderer contemplates a premeditated act. And so here we have someone who has allegedly shot his father while he was sleeping on the sofa. So you can't claim that this is self-defense. There's no evidence at this point that he acted as a crime of passion. So you already see the stasis going into work. We have the facts that are agreed on, and then we have the disputed facts, things that we don't know. And so we can start looking at where the questions are going to go. With regard to Horos, we have the sense of definitions. So we already have people weighing in on what we're going to call things. Now, the lawyer brings up another act or another set of facts altogether, which is the actions of the father. Again, carving out space for within the boundaries of the conversation about this case, we're going to include the behavior of the father. Now, this is particularly important in law because we have rules about whether or not the nature of the victim is a relevant thing to the case. In response to that, we also have the prosecutor immediately going into definition mode. And the reason he does is because stasis is a fundamental part of the legal process. So he immediately goes into defining murder. First-degree murder is when, and just defines that. He rules out by definition self-defense. How can you claim self-defense when dad's sleeping on the sofa? But then he raises the possibility of the crime of passion. So we're starting to get the relevant terms and some of the relevant definitions. Again, setting out the stasis, the stases that we need to go through. In addition, and I don't think we really have yet in this case, I mean, I'm sure it has happened since, but in terms of this article, the question of quality. And that is, what is fair game for this? Are we going to talk about whether or not this was justifiable? So is this a place, is this a state or a situation where we can legitimately question whether Zachary's action was understandable and whether it was something that we have sympathy with? Are we going to include this notion of abuse as a legitimate aspect to the case? Finally, we have the notion of metalepsis. And I think metalepsis occurs in a variety of ways in cases. But the first thing that comes to mind is the notion of Zachary being treated as an adult. So the article says, we asked Cindy Nagel what went through her mind when she saw Zachary in shackles. And I think that this example makes him look very much like an adult. And treating him as an adult is clearly a jurisdictional sort of example. So that is how stasis works. It can work in non-judicial situations as well. It can work in deliberative, but I always think that stasis is much more at home in the judicial situation. So I hope this helps understand one of the inventional/heuristic devices in the canon